I was halfway through my morning coffee when I heard the sirens. Not one, not two, but three police cars came skidding onto my gravel driveway, kicking up a cloud of dust so thick it looked like a scene from a damn apocalypse movie. I blinked, trying to process what was happening. The only crime occurring on my property was me trying to enjoy my coffee in peace. Then, out of one of the cop cars, stomping like she was leading a military raid, came the last person I expected, a short, furious woman clutching a clipboard like it was a weapon. Her oversized sunglasses perched on her face as if she were trying to hide from the law instead of calling them. And then, in the loudest, most entitled voice imaginable, she screamed, "This man has an illegal electric fence. He's endangering the entire community." I didn't even live in her community. It took me a second to process what was happening. The cops, who looked just as confused as I felt, were already fanning out like they were about to uncover a major crime scene. Meanwhile, I stood there in my pajama pants, coffee in one hand, absolutely dumbfounded. This woman, who I recognized from my neighbor's drunken rants as Margaret, the self-proclaimed HOA queen, wasn't even from my neighborhood. Her HOA didn't even reach this far. But that didn't seem to matter to her. She was already pointing dramatically at my fence, which surrounded my 10-acre property, warning the officers about its dangerous, inhumane nature. Now, to be fair, my fence was electric, but it wasn't some cartoonishly overpowered, fry-a-person-to-a-crisp kind of thing. It was a standard livestock electric fence, the kind farmers used to keep coyotes and stray dogs from messing with their animals. Perfectly legal, not even strong enough to harm anything bigger than a raccoon, and most importantly, absolutely none of Margaret's business. One of the officers, who looked like he'd already had enough of this nonsense, turned to me. "Sir, we got a call about an illegal hazard on your property." I sighed, taking a sip of my coffee before answering. "You mean my fence?" The officer nodded. I gestured to it. "It's legal. I've got all the permits." "Want to see?" Margaret let out an outraged gasp. "He's lying," she screeched, jabbing a manicured finger in my direction. "I have photographic proof that this fence is a death trap. What if children wander onto his land? What if someone's pet gets fried?" I glanced at the officer, who looked exhausted already. "Does she even live around here?" I asked, motioning vaguely at Margaret, who was practically vibrating with rage. The officer sighed. "No, she's from the HOA 2 miles away." I set my coffee down on my porch railing and rubbed my temples. "So why is she here?" Margaret's jaw dropped like I had personally insulted her ancestors. "Because your fence affects our property values," she shrieked. "It's ugly. It's dangerous. I will not allow this kind of negligence to ruin our community." One of the younger officers coughed, probably to cover a laugh. The older cop pinched the bridge of his nose and sighed. "Ma'am," he said in the universal tone of someone who deeply regretted their career choices, "this man's property is not in your HOA's jurisdiction." Margaret looked personally offended by the concept of laws not bending to her will. "But it's still near our community," she argued. "And I refuse to let some hillbilly play mad scientist with high-voltage fences." I was about to explain that my fence barely delivered a tickle when, as if on cue, my neighbor's goat, Sparky, trotted up to the fence. Now, Sparky wasn't the brightest creature in the world. He had a habit of getting into places he shouldn't, and an even worse habit of testing his limits. Before anyone could react, Sparky stuck his nose on the fence and got a tiny zap, just a little one, enough to make him jump back in surprise. Margaret screamed like she had just witnessed a murder. The officers and I just stood there, watching as Sparky, completely unfazed, flicked his tail and wandered off like nothing had happened. "Did you see that?" Margaret screeched, clutching her chest as if she were about to faint. An innocent animal, shocked. He could have died. The officer who had been holding back a laugh earlier was now openly smirking. "Ma'am," he said, barely containing his amusement, "it's a livestock fence. It's designed to keep animals safe from predators. That goat just learned not to touch it." Margaret's face turned red. "I don't care. This is unacceptable. I demand you arrest him for animal cruelty." The lead officer turned to me with the expression of a man who had seen some truly stupid things in his life, but this was breaking new records. "Sir," he asked, sounding almost apologetic, "do you want to press harassment charges?" Margaret made a strangled noise. "Harassment? Me? I'm the victim here. I let out a long sigh, then turned to the officers. Nah, I'll pass. I'd rather just get back to drinking my coffee. Margaret gaped at me, completely outraged that I wasn't playing along with whatever insane power trip she was on. This isn't over, she screeched before storming back to her SUV. I'm going to report this to the county. To the mayor. To. Her rant was cut off as she tripped over her own feet and nearly face-planted into the dirt. I didn't laugh. Okay, I did. The officers didn't even try to hide their amusement. One of them gave me a polite nod before they all turned back to their cars, clearly eager to leave this madness behind. As the last cruiser pulled away, Margaret, now red-faced and fuming, climbed into her SUV and sped off, kicking up even more dust than the police had. I watched her go, shaking my head. Crazy lady, I muttered, picking up my coffee. That was the end of it, or so I thought. 2 days later, my mailbox was stuffed with fake violation notices from an HOA I didn't even belong to. And that's when I knew Margaret wasn't done. Not by a long shot. I woke up to find my mailbox stuffed to the brim with papers. At first, I thought it was junk mail, maybe some overzealous credit card offers. But as I pulled out the stack, I realized these weren't just random letters. They were official-looking notices stamped with an HOA logo, an HOA that I did not, under any circumstances, belong to. I flipped through them, feeling my blood pressure rise with each page. Violation notices, fines, threats of legal action, claims that my property was out of compliance with neighborhood aesthetics, warnings that if I didn't remove my hazardous fencing, I would face escalating penalties and possible liens. I actually laughed out loud at that last one. These people had zero authority over my land. They might as well have been sending me monopoly money fines. Shaking my head, I walked back inside, tossing the ridiculous paperwork onto the counter. I had a few options here. I could ignore them, which was tempting. I could lawyer up, which was probably inevitable. Or I could have some fun with this, because if Margaret thought she could intimidate me with empty threats, she had another thing coming. Later that day, I decided to pay a visit to Old Man Jenkins, my neighbor and the unofficial historian of local gossip. I found him sitting on his porch, sipping a beer while Sparky the goat chewed lazily on an old boot. You won't believe this, I said, dropping the stack of HOA nonsense onto the table beside him. He squinted at the papers, then let out a wheezing laugh. Oh, they really don't know when to quit, do they? She's sending me fines from an HOA I'm not even a part of, I said, shaking my head. I didn't think that was even legal. It's not, Jenkins chuckled, taking another sip of his beer. But that never stopped Margaret before. I raised an eyebrow. She's done this before? Jenkins leaned back in his chair, looking entirely too amused by the situation. Son, Margaret's been running that HOA like a dictatorship for the last 10 years. She tried to fine a guy for having the wrong shade of blue on his front door. Threatened to sue a family because their kids' chalk drawings on the sidewalk decreased property values. Hell, she even tried to have a retired veteran evicted from his own house because he put up an American flag without HOA approval. I whistled, and no one stopped her. Oh, plenty of people have tried, Jenkins said. But Margaret's the type who thrives on conflict. The second someone pushes back, she goes nuclear. I sighed, rubbing my temples. Well, I'm not in her HOA, so she can threaten me all she wants. She has zero legal ground. That won't stop her, Jenkins warned. If she can't scare you with fake fines, she'll try something else. He wasn't wrong. The misinformation campaign. A few days later, the next phase of Margaret's insanity began. This time, she wasn't just sending fake fines. She was waging a full-scale misinformation war. I started getting calls from people I didn't even know, concerned strangers asking if my fence had electrocuted a dog. One woman, who claimed to be from some local animal rights group, left a furious voicemail accusing me of running an electric death trap. Confused, I did some digging and found out that Margaret had started a Facebook campaign against me in the HOA's private group. She had posted a completely fake and heavily edited video claiming my fence was killing animals. She'd even thrown in some stock footage of an electrocuted squirrel, probably pulled straight from the internet, to make it look like it happened on my property. The comments were a disaster. "This is disgusting," one person wrote. "How is this man allowed to get away with this?" Another added, "We need to petition the county to shut this down immediately." And of course, there was the classic, Won't someone think of the children? I almost had to admire her dedication. Almost. Instead, I called my lawyer. While I waited for a legal response to this nonsense, Margaret's harassment escalated again. She wasn't content with just spreading lies. Now she was actively trying to frame me for animal cruelty. One evening, I caught movement on my security cameras. Someone was sneaking onto my property near the fence line. I checked the footage and nearly burst out laughing. It was Margaret, dressed in all black, crouching dramatically like a cartoon villain. She was dragging a dog crate with her. From the looks of it, she was trying to release a small animal, probably to get it shocked and record a new expose. Unfortunately for her, things did not go as planned. As she tried to open the crate, she tripped over a rock and landed face first in the dirt. Then, in what I could only describe as poetic justice, she accidentally backed into my fence. The zap wasn't strong, barely enough to make her jump, but the way she shrieked and flailed like she'd been hit by a bolt of lightning was pure gold. She staggered around, cursing, before giving up entirely and running back to her car. I saved the footage immediately. The next morning, I sent a copy to my lawyer, the county animal control, and, just for fun, posted a small, carefully edited clip online. Nothing too aggressive, just a simple caption. When your neighbor trespasses on your land at night and finds out electric fences work as advertised. The video went viral within hours. Thousands of people were laughing at Margaret's antics, with comments ranging from, "This is the greatest thing I've ever seen," to "How do we nominate this woman for the Darwin Awards?" And just like that, her credibility took a major hit. But she wasn't done. 2 nights later, someone tried to cut my fence. This time, they weren't just sneaking around with a camera. They had wire cutters, gloves, and a clear intent to destroy. Fortunately, my cameras caught them in the act, and the sheriff's department didn't take kindly to trespassers with vandalism on their minds. The next morning, I had an unexpected visitor, Margaret, looking furious and wearing a bandage on her wrist. She barely let me open the door before she started screaming. "How dare you?" she shrieked. "You set me up." I stared at her. "What? You put that video online to humiliate me," she accused, pointing a finger at me like she was declaring war. "I demand you take it down immediately." I crossed my arms. "Oh, you mean the video where you were illegally on my property, trying to frame me for animal cruelty?" Her face turned an alarming shade of red. "It was a social experiment." I almost choked. "A what?" "A social experiment," she repeated, crossing her arms like she'd just given me an airtight legal defense. "To test the reaction of the community to unethical animal treatment." I blinked at her. "So you're admitting you trespassed?" Her mouth opened and closed like a fish. "That's not the point." I smirked. "It is when the sheriff sees the footage." For the first time, Margaret actually looked nervous. For a long moment, she just stood there, fuming. Then, without another word, she turned and stomped off toward her car. I watched her go, shaking my head. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The morning after Margaret's latest meltdown, I woke up feeling like I was trapped in a never-ending reality show. At this point, it was almost impressive how much time and energy she was willing to invest in something that had absolutely nothing to do with her. But as much as I wanted to sit back and let her spiral into irrelevance, I had a feeling she wasn't done yet. And sure enough, I was right. It started with a legal notice taped to my front door. Not a real one. Of course, no law office or court in the world would take Margaret seriously. But that didn't stop her from trying. The document, printed on what looked like standard office paper, was labeled as a cease and desist order from the HOA's legal department. The funniest part? There was no legal department. The entire thing was obviously written by Margaret herself, filled with dramatic legalese that made no sense, including phrases like electrical warfare against the community and public safety crisis of imminent concern. At the bottom, she had even signed it in fancy cursive, as if that made it official. I took a deep breath and walked over to Old Man Jenkins's place, holding up the paper like a trophy. He took one look at it and nearly choked on his coffee from laughing so hard. "She really thinks this is going to scare you?" he wheezed, wiping his eyes. "Son, I've seen kids put together more convincing legal documents in school projects." I thought about framing it, or maybe mailing it back to her with a grammar correction, I admitted, shaking my head. "Or hell, send it to the local paper," Jenkins snorted. Let the whole town see what kind of nonsense she's up to. Tempting as that was, I figured it would be better to just let Margaret dig her own grave. And sure enough, she wasted no time pulling out the biggest shovel she could find. Later that evening, I got a call from my lawyer. He sounded more amused than concerned as he explained that Margaret had actually filed a lawsuit against me. Well, technically, it wasn't a real lawsuit, just a small claims complaint, which meant she was trying to drag me to court over the fence. She's demanding emotional damages, my lawyer chuckled. Claims she's been suffering from severe distress due to the unsafe conditions on your property. I nearly dropped my phone. She doesn't even live near me. Doesn't matter, he replied, still laughing. She attached a bunch of fake testimonials from people who also don't live anywhere near you. And get this. One of them claims your fence nearly electrocuted their child last week. I pinched the bridge of my nose. Let me guess, they have no proof. Not a shred, my lawyer confirmed. We're going to tear this apart in 5 minutes. As ridiculous as it was, I showed up to court just to make sure Margaret got the embarrassment she deserved. The small courtroom was filled with bored clerks, an overworked judge, and maybe half a dozen spectators who clearly had nothing better to do. And there, sitting at the plaintiff's table with a smug expression, was Margaret. She had dressed up like she was about to argue a case in the Supreme Court, complete with a stack of folders, a dramatic sigh, and an exaggerated headshake whenever I so much as looked in her direction. When it was her turn to speak, she launched into a speech so theatrical I half expected someone to hand her an Oscar right there in the courtroom. She talked about how my fence had shattered the harmony of the community, how she had suffered emotionally and physically from the stress of knowing it existed, and how she lived in fear of what could happen if I wasn't stopped. The judge, an older woman who looked like she had absolutely no patience for nonsense, cut her off mid-rant. Ma'am, do you have any actual evidence that this fence has harmed you in any way? Margaret hesitated. Well, I have received countless complaints from concerned citizens. Do you have any documentation proving that you are legally allowed to enforce rules on this man's property? The judge asked, already looking unimpressed. Margaret's smugness faltered. Well, no, but as a community leader. The judge sighed. Ma'am, this case has no merit. The defendant's fence is legal on his property and does not fall under your HOA's jurisdiction. Your complaint is dismissed. Margaret turned red. But dismissed, the judge repeated, already moving on to the next case. I barely held back my laughter as I walked out of the courtroom. But Margaret, true to form, wasn't done. She stormed out after me, looking like she had just suffered the greatest injustice in human history. You think this is funny? She hissed, pointing an accusatory finger at me. You haven't won. I will not let you destroy everything we've worked for. I sighed. Margaret, go home. She sputtered, clearly not expecting me to just dismiss her. This is not over, she shrieked before stomping off to her car. I wanted to believe that was the last of it, but later that night, my security cameras caught something even worse. A group of Margaret's HOA minions had snuck onto my property and spray-painted the words HOA rules across the side of my barn. That was the last straw. I called the cops, sent them the footage, and by morning, Margaret and her crew were getting a not-so-friendly visit from law enforcement. This time, she wasn't able to talk her way out of it. The officers found paint cans in the back of her car, along with a handwritten list of targets that she had planned to vandalize. She was arrested on the spot for trespassing and property damage. The fallout was beautiful. With Margaret facing criminal charges, the HOA turned on her faster than a pack of hungry wolves. Residents who had put up with her nonsense for years suddenly found the courage to speak out. The board members, eager to save face, held an emergency meeting and voted her out as HOA president. The same people who once cowered under her rule were now leading the charge to erase every trace of her influence. As for me, I sat back, cracked open a cold beer, and enjoyed the show. A week later, Margaret officially put her house on the market. She couldn't handle the humiliation. She packed up, left town, and as far as I know, hasn't been seen since. On the day she drove away, I stood on my porch, watching as her SUV disappeared down the road. Old Man Jenkins walked up beside me, nodding in approval. Reckon that's the last we'll hear of her, he said. Let's hope, I replied. Sparky the goat wandered over, eyeing the fence like he was thinking about testing it again. I chuckled and patted his head. Not today, buddy, I said. As I took another sip of my drink, I glanced at my fence, still standing strong, still completely legal, and most importantly, still none of Margaret's business. Some people fight for power. Some people fight for justice. Me? I just wanted my damn fence. In the weeks that followed, life on my property returned to normal. The HOA, now under new leadership, sent me a formal apology for Margaret's actions. They even offered to pay for the damages to my barn, though I declined. I didn't want anything from them, just to be left alone. Sparky, the goat, continued to test the fence occasionally, but he'd learned his lesson. The zap was just enough to keep him in line, and he seemed to respect the boundary now. As for Margaret, rumors swirled about where she'd gone. Some said she moved to a small town where no one knew her. Others claimed she'd joined a commune, though I found that hard to believe. Wherever she was, I hoped she'd learned something from the whole ordeal. One evening, as the sun set over my property, I stood by the fence, looking out at the land I'd worked so hard to maintain. It was peaceful, exactly the way I liked it. Old Man Jenkins joined me, a beer in hand. "You know," he said, "you could have just taken the fence down. Saved yourself a lot of trouble." I shook my head. "It's not about the fence, Jenkins. It's about standing up for what's yours. About not letting someone like Margaret dictate how you live your life." He nodded, taking a sip of his beer. "Well, you sure showed her." I smiled. "Yeah, I did." And with that, I turned and walked back to the house, leaving the fence and the past behind me. It was a small victory, but it was mine. And sometimes, that's all that matters. Thank you for taking the time to listen to today's story on Store of Good Stories. If this story touched your heart or made you think, don't forget to hit like and share the video to spread this positive message to more people. And if this is your first time here, make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any of the meaningful stories we share every week. Your support is the biggest motivation for Store of Good Stories to keep bringing heartfelt and valuable stories to you. See you in the next video.